Hey there, listeners. This is Terry Cowley, your host of the R.M.Williams Outback podcast. Thanks so much for being here and welcome to Season 3. The grand story of the famous Birdman John Gould and his talented wife Elizabeth, who revealed the astonishing world of Australian birds and wildlife in one of the most important naturalist expeditions in history, is well told in the recent book Mr and Mrs Gould by award-winning journalist and writer Grant Lee Keeser. It's an extraordinary true story that begins on a cold spring day in 1838 when John and Elizabeth sailed into Australia, crossing 3 oceans from their London home to find Australia's wildlife treasures and showcase them to the rest of the world. Grant Lee Keeser has written about the Goulds for issue 161 of Outback magazine, and he joins me now to expand on this fascinating story. Hello, Grant Lee.
Hi, Terry. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the podcast. Really appreciate it. It's great to be talking about the Goulds, who were a fascinating couple.
Now, I'm looking forward to talking about the Goulds with you. But firstly, for those listeners who may not be familiar with your work as a prolific author, your other books have included subjects such as Hudson Fysh, Matthew Flinders, Sir Joseph Banks, Mary Raby, Lachlan Macquarie, Banjo Patterson, Bert Hinkler, John Monash, and Annette Kellerman. The list goes on, all important names in Australian history. What was it that made you want to write about John and Elizabeth Gould?
Well, I just thought that they were an intriguing couple. You know, it was the 1830s. It was still a very dangerous time for international travel, and Elizabeth Gould left behind some of her children. She brought her eldest child with her, but she undertook a very daring and dangerous voyage to come to Australia with her husband with the dream of documenting Australia's wildlife, specifically the bird life, but also later on the mammals as well. And I just thought, you know, what would possess a woman living in quite comfortable circumstances in London, part of the high society of London, what would possess her to give all that away and risk her life and limb and liberty and to take on this voyage and then spend 2 years in the far-flung shores of Australia documenting Australia's wildlife for the rest of the world. And I just wanted to know more about them. And the more that I found out about the Goulds, the more I was fascinated by their love for each other and also the incredible love that they had for wildlife and the desire to transmit that knowledge to the rest of the world.
How important was it that your story was about both John and Elizabeth?
Well, very important because, history is often unkind or it's ungenerous to women who lived in those times, the 1800s, and I thought it was time to redress the balance because Elizabeth Gould was instrumental in the publication of the birds of Australia and the mammals of Australia. She didn't necessarily get all the recognition she deserved. Some writers have been a little bit unkind to John Gould. They say that he stole all of his wife's work and took the glory for himself. That's not really true. He did in his writings acknowledge the beautiful work that she did. But John Gould, it was a product of his times, and in the 1800s, a man running a business was the king of that empire, and he was generally lauded by the public much more so than the women involved. But I thought it was time to redress the balance and show the beautiful illustrations that Elizabeth Gould actually put together for his works.
Yeah, well, when you look at the illustrations, you wouldn't necessarily know if it was John or Elizabeth, would you? Because they're both skilled artists.
Yeah, well, she was really the more talented artist. His great talent, I guess, as one of his contemporaries said, he was more of a stage manager. I mean, he knew the insides and outs of birds, literally. He'd been a taxidermist, so he knew everything there was to know about birds, and he was the great scientist of the pairing. But she was the artistic talent, and he could stage manage birds the way that they looked, and he could make them lifelike in terms of his taxidermy work so that she could paint them almost as if they were alive. So he had a lot to do with the artwork, but she was the one that completed the finished product.
What sort of a man was John Gould, do you think?
The John Gould who came to Australia in the 1830s, I don't know if that many people who worked for him would really have nice things to say about him. He was a very hard-driving man. He was obviously a brilliant man, and his desire, his ego, was to be known as the great bird expert in the world, which he did achieve. But he was a very hard-driving man. He was often unforgiving. He was often quite ungenerous in the way that he treated some of the people who worked for him. In fact, most of the people who worked for him, apart from his wife, a guy named Edward Lear, who was one of his artists and who became a very famous writer of nonsense poems such as The Owl and the Pussycat. He was very scathing of what John Gould was like, a very coarse man, a very rough man, something of a bully. And other people who worked for John Gould said he was an uncouth, a very tough, uncompromising man. But you can't take away the fact that he had this burning love and this burning desire to tell people all about the bird life, especially in Australia when they made the voyage here. His great desire was to document every single bird that he could find, every different species of bird that he could find, and show them to the world. And he was often very, very hard in driving his other collectors who were out in the field collecting birds for him, in especially the very tragic John Gilbert, who worked tirelessly for John Gould and really didn't get any credit from him until after John Gilbert had passed away, sadly.
So when they came to Australia, it was first stop Hobart.
That's right. That was the first port of call. And they stayed, after a little while in a lodging house, they stayed with John Franklin and his wife, Lady Franklin, John Franklin was the governor of Van Diemen's Land, as it was called in those days, and of great help. I mean, Gould was in some ways a political animal. He knew how to extract as much as he could from governments and from vice-regals and from ship's captains to get the best deal that he could for free passage and things like that, so that he could put together the most profitable books possible. And that he was a businessman. He was the greatest publisher of wildlife books in the early parts of the 19th century. So he used his contacts in government and politics to the best advantage he could, and he did that when he came to the Australian colonies as well.
But then they headed up to New South Wales.
They did, yeah. He spent some time in Van Diemen's Land. I mean, by this stage, Elizabeth, his wife, was pregnant with their Australian baby, Franklin Tasman Gould. So she was confined, of course, but she still did artwork for the publications while John Gould was out in the wilds looking for birds and studying birds as much as he could. But after some time, he then travelled to New South Wales, where Elizabeth Gould had two brothers who were graziers, and very important in the early days of Australian grazing life. And he went out looking in the Liverpool ranges with Aboriginal guides to find lyrebirds and other birds such as the bronze-winged pigeons, and eventually great flocks of what were called betcheragars by the Aboriginal people. He called them budgerigars, and he took some back to England and made them one of the most popular pets in the world.
I was going to ask you about budgies in a minute, but in reading your story, I was very much picturing this man probably really inappropriately dressed for the climate, big jackets, boots, buckles, hats, top hats even, clambering over what would have been pretty wild bush.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I always tell a story about Gould in the Liverpool range, and he had two Aboriginal guides with him, and I'm half certain that they did it just for a ruse. They convinced him that the best way to find lyrebirds, male lyrebirds, was to put feathers in his hair in his hat and dance around in the bush making all sorts of calls. And I'm sure that they went back after the expedition and regaled their families around the fireplace for years about how they made this eccentric Englishman dance around in the bush making bird noises.
Having a good laugh at his expense, fair enough. So tell me about the terrible drought of that time that they arrived into.
Yeah, well, really, Australia, land of flooding rains and severe droughts, and Gould experienced it all. When he arrived in New South Wales in 1839, and again he came back in 1840, the land was very, very severely parched, and he saw thousands of animals, or heard reports of thousands of animals having perished in the drought. A lot of the graziers, including his brothers-in-law, were really doing it tough in these terrible circumstances, conditions that they had certainly not experienced when they came out from England. And they realised that the Australian bush was extremely harsh and dangerous. And it wasn't long before that Gould saw the other extreme, flooding rains so severe with the floods around the Hunter Valley and the northern parts of that area, up Scone and around that area, that several people actually drowned. They got caught, not just thousands of head of cattle and sheep, but several of the men out looking after flocks, including people that Gould knew well, who'd helped him on his expeditions, were caught in sudden flash floods and drowned.
So they were only here for 2 years, is that right?
Yeah.
It's amazing that they did get to experience those extremes.
Both extremes, extremes of nature. And Gould always said that Australia was a land of great extremes, fascinating wildlife, unique wildlife that you could not see anywhere else, but also unique weather patterns too. Some seasons would be extremely harsh and dry, and others such terrible floods of which he'd never experienced anything like that. And as a result of that, Gould always had a great love for Australia and the Australian people because he knew that the hardships that so many of them had to encounter.
I might read a quote from Gould that you've included in your story. He noted, "This great heat and dryness is unaccompanied by night dews, and the falls of rain being uncertain and irregular, droughts of many months' duration sometimes occur, during which the rivers and lagoons are dried up, the land becomes a parched waste, vegetation is burnt up, and famine spreads destruction on every side. Indigenous animals and birds retire to the mountains or to more distant regions, exempt from its influence." And he even talks about bullocks being dead by the roadside or in dried up waterholes. So it obviously had a big impact on him.
It certainly did, and it showed him just what a harsh and hostile country it could be, especially for foreign settlers such as people of his own country, Britain, and his brothers-in-law who'd come out here, used to cities like London or rural life around London, and they come out to Australia as conditions unlike anything that they had ever seen. Even one of John Gould's brothers-in-law became so despondent at the situation. Some seasons had been of plenty, but then all of a sudden it could be taken away by the drought or by the floods, and he ended up taking his own life eventually, many years down the track. Yeah, because he was so despondent about the life of the life of the grazier.
Oh, that's awful, gee. And they wouldn't necessarily have had the skills to make a go of it in our climate.
That's exactly right. They had to learn on the job, and sometimes the job was too difficult for them.
So in contrast to many of the colonists of the time, Gould often remarked on the reverence Indigenous Australians had for nature and wrote about them with affection and sympathy.
Even though he was a very tough, uncompromising kind of man to some of the people who worked for him, Gould really did develop a great deal of affection and respect for the Indigenous people. He had a couple of guides who certainly helped him around the Scone area and getting up into the Liverpool range when he was looking for lyrebirds, and they were of great assistance to him. And he developed a really great respect and admiration for them. And he wrote that they treated the animals and wildlife around them with a spiritual reverence. They really did. Whereas the Europeans, such as himself, could treat animals just as commodities, he saw that the Indigenous people really had a reverence and a spiritual connection to the land and the animals within that land, including the birds.
But talking about the birds as commodities, he certainly had a desire to possess all the birds, though, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He wasn't a conservationist, as we would say, as we would look at conservationists today. He did have a great desire that these birds would be preserved, but he also had an egotism of a collector that he wanted to possess, just about every bird he could, and even some that were threatened species. He had no hesitation in blasting them and turning them into lifelike taxidermist subjects. So he had that egotistical desire when it came to collecting birds, but at the same time, he was shocked and appalled at the wholesale slaughter of bird life that occurred later in the 1800s when feathers became real fashion items for ladies' fashion, and he was appalled that great populations of birds were being destroyed, especially hummingbirds in South America were being destroyed for ornate feathers.
So you said he would blast them. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
How would they be caught?
Well, he would shoot them with a shotgun often, not always, but this was the days before binoculars and high-speed cameras, and the only way that you could study a bird in detail, it was very hard to catch them live if they were far off.
Wouldn't they be somewhat altered if they've been shot?
Well, he was a very skilled taxidermist. Don't forget, he was his first great brush with or meeting with fame was as the taxidermist for the King George IV. and he stuffed the royal giraffe, which had died, and he got the job of making this creature that was the king's favourite pet as lifelike as possible. So he gained a great reputation, and stuffed birds were the must-have item in the early 1800s for the aristocracy in their drawing rooms and parlours. So he developed a great skill in taking dead birds, even birds that were sent to him, just their skins from distant lands would be sent to him, preserved in alcohol and whatever, and arsenic was used as a preservative. He developed a great skill in making them as lifelike as possible. So to study birds from a scientific point of view, it was necessary in his day and age to shoot them. Or so sometimes they caught them live, but not very often. I mean, Gould was intrigued. It sounds odd these days. A lot of people just see them as garden pests, but the brush turkey, especially up in here, Queensland, I mean, they rip gardens to pieces. But he was fascinated by them and spent years studying live specimens. He studied them at Alexander Macleigh's house at Punt Point. Alexander Macleigh had a great farm there, and the brush turkeys were always visiting. And Gould he spent a lot of time trying to decide whether they're actually some sort of turkey, some sort of poultry, or actually a branch of the vulture family. He eventually ate one and decided that they were actually poultry. So that was one of the tests in those days.
Fair enough. So in 1839, Gould was back in New South Wales, back in the Hunter Valley area, or what we know as the Hunter Valley. Soon after that, he arrived in Sydney to greet the officers from the Beagle. Now, what was the significance of this to the Gould story?
Well, the Beagle was a ship that played a great deal of throughout Gould's life. Initially, in the early 1830s, it had gone on a voyage to South America, doing a hydrographic survey, working out where the best places were for shipping lanes and shipping ports along the coast of South America. And on board was a young naturalist called Charles Darwin, who at the time was studying to be a vicar. And Darwin observed at the Galapagos Islands, he collected one of his assistants collected a number of different sorts of finches. And Darwin had brought them back to England, but didn't really think a great deal of them. But he showed them to the world's top bird expert, John Gould, and Gould came up with the idea that they were all branches of the finch family, but they all had, depending on what island they were in the vegetation there, they had developed different beaks to access the food. Some had thick, heavy beaks for crushing seeds. Some had long, thin beaks for sucking out nectar from plants. So Gould came up with the idea, it was his theory really, that these birds hadn't been created this way by God, that they had actually developed or evolved their beaks to suit their circumstances. Thus was born the idea of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin went away and thought about what Gould had said and over time developed the theory of what we now call evolution, and of course the groundbreaking book, The Origin of Species. So the Beagle had played a big role in Gould's reputation for science at the time, but the Beagle sailed on other voyages, and Gould would always get the captains and the officers there to wherever they called, find birds that he had never seen and bring them back. And the Beagle was instrumental in bringing back all sorts of birds for Gould from all different parts of the world, wherever it sailed. The crew aboard the Beagle first collected the bird that became known as the Gouldian finch, which Gould named after his wife. Yeah, so it played a big role in his life.
Yes, named after his wife. Well, he could have called it the Elizabethan finch rather than his own name.
Yeah,
but anyway, because presumably she wasn't always Elizabeth Gould. Anyway, so you did touch on it, but the story of Gould and our beloved household and wild bird, the budgie, is an interesting one. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. Well, Gould had known about the budgies for a while because Charles Sturt was an Englishman and the great explorer of South Australia and other parts of the world. He told Gould about these beautiful little parakeets that he'd seen, and he'd actually brought a dead one back to England to show the Linnean Society and the Zoological Society. But while Gould was on his great explorations in western New South Wales, beyond out near Narrabri and those places out in sort of central New South Wales, he saw great flocks of them, hundreds and hundreds of these small, beautiful birds, and Gould was fascinated by them. He fell in love with them. He thought they were just the most beautiful creatures. He called them the most amiable little creatures you could meet, and he was fascinated by the way that they could mimic sounds. And he was determined, while so many birds that he took back to Britain were dead, were actually stuffed carcasses, he resolved to take some live examples of these birds back to England, which he did. And they became very much his party piece for a long time. He would trot them out at parties. He even shows some where Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was. He would have them in his pocket, and he'd have a look at this, Your Highness. This is a bird from Australia, from New South Wales. And they became his great party piece. And Gould promoted these birds as such beautiful pets, such amiable little friendly pets, that they became the must-have item in British homes. And they became, after dogs and cats, it said that budgies are the most popular pet in the world, which is extraordinary. And Gould did that because he was intrigued by these examples of Australian wildlife. And I often say to people in talks that I give about the Goulds, it's a shame that he didn't take some live thylacines back, Tasmanian tigers, and introduce them as these incredible, unique things from Australia, a carnivorous marsupial, because perhaps English people might have taken to them, or European people might have taken to them, and they may have been preserved as pets, and we might have millions of them in the world today instead of none, because they became extinct.
So his illustration of the Tassie tiger became a bit of an enduring symbol, didn't it?
Very much.
And he did voice some concerns about whether they were going to survive, didn't he?
Yeah, as we were saying earlier, Gould shot a lot of animals to study them for scientific purposes, but he was appalled and really fearful that so much wildlife would end up getting destroyed and become extinct because of European expansion. And he feared that he wrote in the 1850s that the Tasmanian tiger, or the thylacine, was in danger of becoming extinct because farmers were treating them as pests and just exterminating them wholesale. And he said before long it's going to become like the English wolf, non-existent, which is exactly what happened, very, very sadly, within about 8 decades. And he even feared the koalas would become extinct too. And, back in the 1920s and 1930s, that was a very real possibility when they were hunted for their skins, and there was a huge trade in koalas. So thankfully that hasn't happened, but they're certainly very, very low in numbers and an endangered species. And they were once very plentiful in this country.
So they went back home and he published The Birds of Australia, which was released between 1840 and 1848, the first comprehensive work on Australian ornithology. Tell me a little bit about that process and the other books that he published, and also his naming of species was so important, wasn't it?
Gould's books came out on a subscription basis. He would publish them, parts of them, every month, rather than one huge volume at a time, because it took a long time to make the paintings, of course. So they would be published in parts. You'd get an instalment every month with a few birds and a few paintings on it. So the volumes of the book took 8 years eventually for it all to appear. And at the same time, he was also publishing other books. I mean, he published other books that really cemented his place as the foremost bird expert in the world, because they were being done simultaneously. He and Elizabeth at first worked on a book called Birds of the Himalayas, which came about because he had been sent 100 bird skins from the Himalayan mountains. And so they just thought these creatures were so exotic that they had to put them together. The names that he gave the birds are pretty much exactly as he named them. Some have slightly changed. Some of the parrots have been given slightly different names over time. Things like the paradise parrot was called the beautiful parrot for a time. But the names have pretty much stayed the same. But Gould could be, as we were saying earlier, he could be a very, very hard man. And his great sidekick was John Gilbert. John Gould spent 2 years in Australia. John Gilbert, who was working for him, spent 5 years on 2 different voyages and risked his life and ultimately paid with his life for his enthusiasm to collect birds.
How did he die?
Well, he was speared by Aboriginal people up in northern central Queensland. Yeah, it was a very, very sad end. The guy had just been making notes about birds when they were attacked, and there was a skirmish, and he was spared. He was the only one of the party to die, and he was probably the kindest to all the Aboriginal people of the whole party. It was Leichhardt's, one of Leichhardt's expeditions. And but he just got caught in the crossfire, unfortunately, and died a long, long way from home. And but he, not long before that, he'd come across the most exquisite bird on the Condamine River, which is southern Queensland, northern New South Wales area, around that area, around modern day St George, the town of St George. He'd come across this most exquisite parrot, and he'd asked Gould very, very nicely. He wrote to him saying, if it's in your heart to name a bird after me, I would be so grateful. Gould didn't. He just called it the beautiful parrot, and it became known as the Paradise Parrot. Sadly, there hasn't been a live example seen in 100 years of this most beautiful creature. But unkindly, he did name a creature called Gilbert's rat, which is now known as a potteroo. So he could be a very hard and ungenerous man after everything that poor John Gilbert had done for him.
But that's an important point. He's named a lot of things that are now extinct.
He did, yeah. Many of the birds that he named have become extinct, probably more than 20 of them.
Yes, you quoted some figures along those lines, didn't you? You said the Australian Museum records that since the European colonisation of Australia, 21 species of birds and 27 species of mammals have been declared extinct. I'm actually surprised the numbers aren't higher.
Well, some of them were thought to be extinct, and they've found a few examples, but you wonder how long those examples will still be around. Even the beautiful Gouldian finch
yes, they have struggled.
It's struggled, and there was a report just recently that so much of its habitat has been destroyed that there's real concerns that they'll go too. So many things that, sadly, in this country, I think so many of us take for granted. Like lorikeets just out in the garden. If you saw one in a zoo and you hadn't seen one before, you say, "Wow, what is this?" The Gouldian finch, like a bird that's lilac and green and yellow and red. It's just stunning. The rosellas, the king parrots, are just stunning.
Yes, you couldn't design one better looking.
That's exactly right. And people back in the 1840s, they're getting their little parcel from John Gould. It's the latest instalment of Birds of Australia. They open up and it's wow. And then later on, Mammals of Australia, they open it up and it's wow. There's a giant kangaroo head. There's a wombat. There's a koala.
Yeah, so you wonder, did it make them want to go there, or did they then hear what he said about the climate and then were scared off? Maybe it's a bit of both.
A little bit of both, yeah. It was a long way in those days. It wasn't a comfortable journey. It was at least 4 months by sea, and you just hope that you got there.
So, I want to sort of perhaps wrap up by talking about the legacy of the Goulds, but of course there's one thing that might spring to mind for many people, and that's the Gould League, which was founded in 1909. I'm pretty sure I had something to do with the Gould League when I was at primary school.
Probably not as obviously as widespread as it was, but it's still doing great work and it's still raising awareness of our wildlife. But even apart from the Gould League, I think what the Goulds really did was put a focus on Australian wildlife as never before. And, until probably their books came along, so many people so many of the colonists in this country would have taken our wildlife for granted. Thylacines, they're just a pest you just shoot out the back. Well, koala, that's something you can make a pair of gloves out of. Whereas the Goulds show that these are unique creatures and that if we didn't look after them, and especially later in his life, Gould was always writing that unless we looked after the wildlife that we had and treated it with respect, we were going to lose it and we would never get it back. And that's what happened with so many species around the world because mankind's greed got in the way and they were destroyed for profit, short-term profit.
And of course, they're here for a reason, kind of tying in with what you were saying earlier about the theory of evolution, etc. The animals becoming extinct changes the ecology of the place.
Sure does.
And of course, pastoralists wanted a healthy environment ultimately, didn't they?
Yeah, and they suffered because of it. Yeah, they suffered because of the extinction of these species, and not just from terms of profit, but just the beauty and the wonder that they brought. I mean, the Goulds looked at these creatures that they had never seen before, not in zoos or had never even read about. They were seeing them for the first time, and they just thought, how could there be creatures so sublime and so magnificent out in the wild? What can we do to raise awareness about them, to tell people about them, and hopefully to preserve them for eternity?
So, Grantley, you have another book that's already come out, and no doubt you're on to another project. So perhaps we can finish off this talk by asking you about what you're working on now.
Well, at the moment, I had a book come out about a year ago on Vivian Bullwinkle, and we're hoping that she was a nurse who survived a massacre in World War II and devoted the rest of her life to helping others in memory of the nurses who didn't come back. And we've had preliminary discussions about hopefully making that into a film series, a television series. So that's keeping me pretty busy and occupied. My present book that's just come out is about Annette Kellerman, who was Australia's first great international swimmer, but she went beyond that to become our first great movie star too. And she was a huge star in the days around World War I, when massive amounts of funding from movies were used to showcase her talent. She made a movie in 1916, which was the most expensive movie ever made to that time, with a cast of more than 20,000. She was a woman who was right at the front of female rights and empowering women around the world. She was a great fitness influencer and a great star. And later in the year, we're going to be producing a book about Mary Penfold, who founded the Penfolds wine dynasty with her husband, Christopher Rawson Penfold. But unfortunately, Mary hasn't really got a little bit like the Elizabeth Gould situation, she hasn't really got the kudos that she deserved as the winemaker and the person who actually grew the grapes.
So with all of that, I don't think it's the last time we're going to be chatting, Grantley.
I hope not. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it, Terry. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your time, Grantley.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Don't forget, you can read all about the Goulds in Grantley Keyes' story for Outback Magazine, and that's in issue 161. If you'd like to know more about Outback, you can go to outbackmag.com.au. Thanks for listening.